In 1877, the U.S. was in the grips of a severe economic depression. The effects were being felt everywhere, including the railroad business. To make up for financial losses, some of the major railroads were cutting back. For instance, the Pennsylvania Railroad had cut wages by 10% in May, then again in June. By July, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was cutting wages for the second time in 8 months. Anyone making over $1 a day was to be cut by 10%, and employees would only work 2 days a week instead of 3. At one time, a trade union would have fought against the salary and wage cut for the workers, but the Depression had left them virtually powerless. So, on July 16, 1877, workers for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in Martinsburg, West Virginia, took things into their own hands. They unhooked the nearly 600 locomotives and declared that the trains would stay put until the cut was repealed. Soon, a crowd gathered to show their support, and the police were dispatched. When they were unable to break the strikers up, the governor sent in the militia. The militia wasn't much help, though, because they were sympathetic to the workers' plight. So, the trains remained stranded until the governor asked President Hayes for help. He answered by sending in federal troops, a move that resulted in trains getting to leave the station. While this would seem like a victory for the governor and the Baltimore and Ohio Company, the situation was actually getting worse. The strike now extended beyond Martinsburg all the way to stations in Chicago. The Pennsylvania Railroad in Pittsburgh also followed their lead, and the workers were able to take control of the city before federal troops arrived. The story was the same in St. Louis, too. A strike in Maryland on July 20th became very dramatic and resulted in violence. The militia had been dispatched to take control of strikers who were delaying trains in Cumberland. Members in the crowd had thrown stones at the guardsmen, and they fired back. The event left at least 10 dead, including a newsboy and a teenager. In response, angry rioters in Baltimore burned and derailed train cars and even cut the fire hoses to prevent anyone from extinguishing the fires. At one point, there were approximately 14,000 protesters involved before President Hayes sent in the federal troops to regain control. A day before the Baltimore incident, a rail yard strike in Pittsburgh had ignited. On top of the recent wage cuts, the Pennsylvania Railroad had also announced it would be doubling the length of trains heading east, but without additional staff. This did not sit well with the workers, who reacted by blocking the movement of all trains. Other workers from the city, including miners and iron and steel workers, joined the side of the railroad employees. It seemed the entire city was now on strike. The police and local National Guard unit made little effort to handle the situation. The governor, frustrated by the lack of local cooperation, sent in Guard units from Philadelphia. On July 21st, the new units tried to establish control and ultimately fired upon a crowd that had formed. A riot broke out as armed crowd members fired back. 20 were dead, including a woman and a few children, before the guardsmen finally withdrew into a roundhouse. The angry mob set fire to trains and buildings and damaged other railroad property, all while continuing to exchange gunfire with the guards. This went on until the next night, by which time 20 more crowd members and 5 guardsmen had died. The Pennsylvania Railroad reported approximately $4 million in losses as well. With an overtasked National Guard, chaos continued through the rest of Pennsylvania for the next 8 days. Workers in other towns went on strike, factories and stores closed, railroad property was damaged, and fires were set all before the National Guard and federal troops could ultimately regain control. Multiple cities from the Midwest and Northeast were dealing with strikes by July's end, too. Many railroad fraternal organization leaders were alarmed by the riots, and the phrase communist insurrection was being tossed around by a paranoid upper class. In some states, such as Ohio, citizens even formed a type of police corps to protect their cities from the havoc being caused by the strikers. Within a month, the strikes were waning, however. The unorganized demonstrations by angry workers with no true leaders just could not hold ground against the Federal Army. Plus, the railroads were back up and running, thanks to strikebreakers, individuals hired to work in place of the employees on strike. By the time the Great Railroad Strike had ended, there were nearly 100 people dead and 10 times as many arrested. And for what? Well, nothing, unfortunately. It had only temporarily shut down commerce. Wages continued to be cut, and unions continued to be squashed by the wealthy industrialists. Their lack of success, however, did not deter future railway strikes. The 1880s and 1890s would also see their fair share of rail worker demonstrations. Let's quickly review. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 came at a time when the country was in the grips of an economic depression. Railroads were trying to make up for the financial losses by cutting wages, which created anger among the workers. A strike on July 16, 1877, in Martinsburg, Virginia, against the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad sparked more demonstrations in several Midwest and Northeast cities. Especially violent riots in Baltimore and Pittsburgh left over 100 people dead and railroad property damage in the millions. The strikes lasted approximately a month before the National Guard and Federal Army was able to regain control and get the trains rolling again. Unfortunately, no significant changes were made in response to the strikes.